Uh, I have the pleasure of introducing Benjamin Jardine and also the panel, Awerangi Tamihere, Edmund McCombs, and Jen Riley. It's wonderful to have a collection of incredible thought leaders in this space. And I will hand over to Benjamin, though, to do a more fulsome introduction and to lead the panel discussion. Over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Simon. All right, time for the panel discussion. So this is the second year that we've run one of these panel discussions, and you've invited me all back, so we must have enjoyed the first one. So I have a really simple recipe for these panel discussions. I invite fabulous people to come along and do a much better job than me of talking about social impact measurement. And as you'll see today, we have an extraordinary panel for you. And then I throw a few spicy questions into the mix to see if we can provoke some really deep conversations about how the social impact measurement space is evolving. So just before we dive into that, if you have any questions for the panel, please do use the chat function, pop those in throughout the conversation. And if we have time at the end, we'll pick up some of those and put them to our panel. All right, so can I ask our panelists to pop on their videos and microphones, and I will give you a bit of background on each of our extraordinary panelists that we have brought to the table. So first off, can I introduce Awerangi Tamihere, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency. Awerangi has spent the last 3 decades working with Maori communities. Understanding and measuring social return has become an effective framework for Whānau Ora to assess how to invest in the strength of Whānau, the family unit, and to assess lasting change over time. For Awerangi, Whānau is first and foremost. She promotes an integrated and collaborative model of care, creating space for Whānau to co-produce what services look like. And that takes a diversity of stakeholders into account. Awerangi is at the forefront of developing new approaches with the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency, a New Zealand Indigenous commissioning agency which has over 100 Indigenous social impact partners across New Zealand, collectively working together to demonstrate the change that matters the most for Maori. The social impact program that has been modelled on her work with Te Whānau o Waiperera, an urban Indigenous provider in Auckland that has been leading and championing outcomes and social value in New Zealand since 2012. Thank you, Awerangi, so much for joining us on the panel, and thank you for forgiving my terrible mangling of the Maori language throughout that.
It's fine. You did better than some of the Kiwis, so all good.
I will take that. Thank you, Awerangi. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Edmund McCombs, who is the Group Head of Social Impact at Lendlease and a new SIMNA Board Director. And we're delighted to have Edmund on board in helping shape SIMNA's future. Edmund is the Head of Social Impact at Lendlease and started working for Lendlease all the way back in 2009, where he originally focused on accessible design and providing equitable access to all people in the built form. In that role, Edmund has worked with various community and advocacy groups, and it's that led him to unlock his passion for social sustainability and community development. Edmund now leads Lendlease's sustainability and foundation team, and this is where he's found that his work genuinely aligns to his passion, helping people and communities around the world. Welcome, Edmund. Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
And our final wonderful panelist is Jen Riley, the Chief Impact Officer at Our Community. So Jen joined Our Community as Chief Impact Officer in January of 2022 and brings to the role over 20 years of working in the social sector for both government and not-for-profits. Skilled in strategic planning, program and product design and management, outcomes measurement and evaluation, Jen is currently focused on the rollout of the outcomes engine within Smarty Grants and helping clients to collect and report on their outcome data across grant portfolios. Jen's passion is technology and outcomes and helping organisations understand and improve their impact. Jen is also a board director of the Windana Drug and Alcohol Service and is a co-chair of SIMNA's Senior Leaders Roundtable. Jen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ben.
All right. So we don't hold back on the hard questions here at SIMNA. So we're going to kick off with a bit of a provocative one. We're going to start with the big ticket question. Has all of this social impact measurement stuff been worth it? So we can draw social impacts history all the way back to at least 1969, when deep conversations were being held about the need to consider the social and environmental aspects of investment. And the promise at the time was that if we were able to account for social and environmental impacts, we could learn what works. We could better allocate our investments, and we could make progress on major social challenges. So that was 5 decades ago. And critics have started to say, look, social impact hasn't necessarily delivered on its promise, that practices are scattered, that they're inconsistent, that we're not yet able to shape meaningfully public policy. So, has social impact measurement delivered on its promise? Why or why not? Jen, you must have seen many organisations throughout your career and working at our community. Why don't you kick us off? Has this all been worth it? Is it delivering on the promise?
Well, as somebody who's, spent most of my career in this space, I have seen it done well. And, and I think it has delivered on its promise. I've seen it change practice and policy firsthand. And I think there are many examples within the nominees as well for today where I've seen it, been done really well. And that's why I believe in it. I believe that when done well, this is the caveat, social impact measurement can change the world. But has it been implemented well across the board? I have to agree with the critics that the application of social measurement in Australia is somewhat scattered and inconsistent. And there are a number of reasons why. And I'd actually invite the audience to think about some of the reasons they think why, and perhaps pop their answers in the chat, because I think that would be really interesting. Why is it so inconsistent in terms of application? So I'm going to invite the audience just to pop in a few ideas there. And I think there are many, many reasons, but fundamentally, I do think it comes down to resourcing. At 21, which was some 23 odd years ago, I started my career working for Oxfam Australia, where 10% of every program budget was provided to monitoring and evaluation. And this had a number of benefits. Firstly, it got done. And every project had, monitoring and evaluation. And I saw how beneficiaries benefited from the learnings. We also saw that measurement and evaluation was proportionate to the size of the program budget. And the other thing was that capacity was built up within Oxfam to do measurement and evaluation. Every program manager was trained and supported by internal and external consultants to do evaluation well. So this was not just something that happened at Oxfam, though. This was something that happened across international aid. So every aid organisation, all multilateral funders such as the World Bank, United Nations, and our very own Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has this 10% as a standard. So there is precedent in Australia to have budgets for monitoring and evaluation. So when I began working on domestic programs sort of some 15 years ago, I was surprised that there wasn't a budget for monitoring and evaluation. And I was working at United Way at the time, and I sort of went, well, we need to do this, we need to do it well, and carved out the budget and made sure that we wrote our first impact report. I then moved into consulting. And as a consultant, I was always interested that we were brought in as a separate piece. And on large scale government programs, we were often brought in towards the end or right at the beginning to do the framework and right at the end. But who was doing the bit in the middle? Who was doing the bit to learn? So I think there's definitely a time and a place for external evaluators, but it is often something that's done to you by someone else, and the learnings, go out the door with the evaluators. I think where I've seen it work well across the last 20 odd years of my career is where I've seen the program managers take ownership for it. And I really believe that if the program managers and their teams working alongside community do the design, the measurement and the evaluation of their own programs, and we've seen few examples of this with the nominated projects, then it will be consistent, and we'll see it being taken up across the board. But until it becomes part and parcel of that everyday work, I think we're at risk of it continuing to be something that occasionally works well, but we're not getting that full promise, as was talked about before. So I'm on a bit of a mission at my new role at our community, working with granting organisations to say, look, if you want people to do this, if we want to learn what's working, then you really need to fund it. Otherwise, we'll end up with this inconsistency across the board. And I think as technology continues to evolve, we're going to have some interesting opportunities, but there's also a challenge, and the robots are here. And do we want somebody else coming in and scanning us and giving us a score? Then I think we really need to get on with it and do a good job well.
Thank you, Jen. Certainly picking up my challenge of throwing out the challenges to the room. Okay, we're going to be replaced by robots. I can hear the frustration, Jen, and looking at the comments coming through on the chat, there's lots of comments about lack of standardization, lack of funding, lack of resourcing and ownership. So definitely striking a chord there. Awerangi, from your experience in the New Zealand context and as a commissioning agency, your thoughts?
There are plenty of people in New Zealand who would exactly say that. Let's put that straight. No funding, don't have the resources. It's not seen as consistent at all. But having said there are some sites of excellence and doing well. But the thing you have to remember in social impact, and I'm only talking about in the social policy space that we work in, it's complex. It's highly complex. Now, if you tell me from 1960s to now, we should have had the answer and got it right, I'd be really worried that we've actually got the right methodology and tool, because social impact is a journey, not a destination. And if you decide I've got the answer, here it is, let's move on, then I think we're having the wrong conversation right from the beginning, right? So it's never the end point, because the journey is far more important than actually determining what the actual result is. What it is identifying that we have complex issues, identifying that we've got to start to look at it differently and value the journey we're on and look at the lessons we're learning to take the next step. But in a moment in time, you can't actually tell how far you've come. And I'll give an example of that. It's just recently with one of our Indigenous organisations, they looked back at 4 generations of Māori Indigenous families who have been through it. Now, in a moment in time, they could only see what happened in a program and a service. But 4 generations later, when they did a research program, look back, the results were phenomenal, right? So if you've got people talking in a moment in time, no, it's scattered, it's not a great result, it's not there. So what I'm saying to you is when you're on a learning journey for social impact, it's just about the insights, not for that necessarily that moment in time, but the insights when you look back at what you have collected, because it really does tell you how far you come. But there is a long way to go. And it's a long way to go because not just only about funding, which is one issue, where it does work is when you're not relying on the goodwill of an individual and organisation, when you actually have an organisation that has built at the heart, at a governance level, that social impact outcomes is at the heart of how it looks at valuing its contribution and its wealth. If you look at building the behaviour, the changes of the workforce, and if you look at the same time as building the culture. Now that takes a long time. Even if you look at one organisation, for us, we can explain one, Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency, which you talked about. We're on the journey and that started in 2012 and we're in 2022. Now we have come a long way, but if you ask some of our staff now, they'd say it's scattered, it's not in place, because we're always on looking at what the next step is rather than how far you come. So you've got to be careful at how you look at that. But also for us in New Zealand, and I can share about that further on, is that when we built the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency, we started with looking at like-minded organisations across New Zealand to join this. We started building a backbone of a social impact entity that could provide the support to start to building those organisations together, because you actually also have to start to look at a systems approach to outcomes, not just an individual program for a moment in time, not just an individual service for a moment in time. Because if you look at doing outcomes for a moment in time and in a service, hold on, for us, those same families still come back 3 years later and nothing's changed. because you've got to take a systems approach to complex issues, and that takes a longer time to do. And that is actually where the elephant in the room is. How can you not just evidence what you're doing in a moment of time? How can you really evidence the change that matters so it's sustainable, enduring outcomes? And that is actually the conversation we're at in terms of our integrated model with partners across our network, is moving now to a systems model. Now, when you get to a systems model, what you start to do, and what SIMNA is starting to do, obviously, and also Social Value International, is you're starting to build a movement. And when it gets to a movement, that's when you're changing mindsets, that's when you're changing behaviours, and that is when you start to take the next step in looking at social impact being really embedded. But I think this conversation, the question that you raised, you'll still get the same answer in 20 years' time, right? It's just that we won't realise how far we've moved on, right? So there's a point in this where you've got to reflect, look at how far we've come, and then still say there's a lot of work to do. And the other question you raised was about public policy. And for us, that's a really interesting thing for us about public policy, because in the public policy place in New Zealand is very much still seen as government agencies will do the top-down approach. They determine what the issues are. They determine the investment priorities. They will roll it out. So you're still dealing with a business model that's based on a top-down approach, which is not owned by the people very much on the community who need to own it if you're going to make those outcomes more enduring and sustainable. So we're just involved with the pilot now where 3 government agencies have combined vote funding for the very first time to put it into the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency to look at how they can do a different type of funding model where it's very hard for them. They're no longer at the front, they're sitting at the back, they hand the funding over and they wait to see what the outcomes are coming back. And that's a pilot we're trialling in New Zealand. But the reason that is happening is because, as you know, about 6 years ago, it's the very first time we've had a Prime Minister hold a wellbeing portfolio, reducing child poverty. And so when you have living standards wellbeing owned by the Prime Minister as a cabinet portfolio, you start to be able to see some shifts happening at the top level, as well as some shifts happening at the bottom level. So it's not one or the other, but there are learnings along the way that are starting to make the shift.
Brilliant perspective, Awerangi. Thank you. I love the focus on moving away from just the transactional evaluation to the systemic, bringing it to the heart of organisations and public policy, as you say. So, Edmund, you're in a role that probably didn't exist 10 years ago in an organisation that may not have even had social impact at the time. I'd love to hear your perspective on the journey and your thoughts on this challenge of, is it all worth it and has it delivered on the promise?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Is it all worth it? Absolutely, I would say yes. Has it delivered on the promise is obviously open to interpretation. And I have no doubt, as we will see, there are really great examples and sometimes there are really poor examples. But if I take my perspective as someone working in a corporate environment that has been tasked to look at measuring the social value that we create in our business and through the work that we do, it was initially a very cumbersome project because I found that trying to get a base level understanding across a cohort of people of what social valuation is, what do we need to track, what does it all mean, what are these different terms, that's very confusing. But what I appreciate about it is that there's a robustness behind it, there's a rigor behind it, and I think all of that is really great. But where I think it perhaps as a next step to further deliver on its promise is how do you distill all of that greatness down and all of that academia into ways that average, public can understand? Because you can have these really great opportunities where you've got these really rigorous measurement standards, but if it doesn't trickle down to a higher level understanding to the people that are actually delivering to the beneficiaries and delivering the social outcomes, that's where it creates a real gap in allowing social valuation to live to its fruition and to really bring forth what it was hoping to do. And I think for me, that's something, and we'll talk about it later in this panel, but that's something where I recognize that on the journey that we're at Lendlease, to be able to measure and report on the value we're creating through our work that we're doing, that's a real point of privilege that not everyone has access to do so. And it is interesting to think about that and how we could make social valuation accessible to all.
Brilliant, Edmund. Thank you. And a perfect segue into my next question. It's almost like I planned it this way. But we have touched on resourcing a fair bit. And I was reflecting on the other day, I have moved from a $100 million organization recently to CEO of a very small organization. And we hear a lot of smaller organizations talking about this almost belief that social impact measurement punishes them or might be hurting them, because we are actually seeing social impact measurement starting to influence funders, to influence public policy. But is the consequence of that it's making larger organizations with sophisticated measurement and evaluation capabilities win more of the funding, get more of the attention? Does it unfairly punish these smaller organizations? And do you have any advice for small organizations? So Edmund, do you want to kick us off on this, given you brought up the resourcing challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think, just to be fully honest with it, absolutely a smaller organization would be at a disadvantage. And I think to think differently is probably not fair or giving justice to the amount of work that it takes to deliver on social valuation, the outcomes, and capturing the measurement. For me, one of the biggest hurdles ultimately comes down to cost. When budgets are strapped, this is not something that many people would see as necessary to get across the line. I know we can argue that, and we should argue that, but I do think that in a black and white world, that's something that would be chopped, and people would rather you spend your limited budget on doing the good as opposed to measuring the perceived good that you think you're doing. Which, as to Jen's point earlier, there is a benefit to that measurement. Obviously, you don't want to waste your time and do stuff that's not creating value, but I do understand why in a crunch people pull that money back from that. What I would say is, when you are at a small organization and you are seeing these trends and these themes where more and more requirements are coming up about how you respond to social valuation and social measurement, social impact measurement, is to just start small. I can talk a little bit about our journey. So at Lendlease, what we've done is we have a target to create $250 million of social value by 2025, which is through our shared value partnerships at a corporate level. So that's confusing as enough, because we're dealing with multiple partners from around the world, but it all comes from the same funding line, so we can track everything quite diligently as we go. But in February and March in our business, we are rolling out 3 social metrics to our entire business globally to start to get baseline data of the social value that we're creating in the business. Now, I realize that that's a big step for a lot of organizations, but my reason for saying that in relation to this is because our task is to be as simple as possible. We're starting small. We're putting out 3 metrics. We know these 3 metrics don't appeal or don't apply rather to everyone, but we've got to start somewhere across our hundreds of locations around the world. So I would say, as the piece of advice to a smaller organization or to a bigger organization, wherever you're at on the journey of social valuation measurement, keep it small and keep it simple, because then you'll start to, you will learn as you grow. Social valuation isn't this black and white that I think a lot of people want. It's the gray. Human beings are very much the gray, and that's what we've got to learn to tread within and just keep trying and seeing how you go, because you will always learn and become smarter with your measurement with each step along the way.
Brilliant, Edmund, thank you. And can I just say how refreshing it is to open with that honesty and transparency about the conversation before we even start. And I'm certain many people on this call would be very familiar with that pressure that you speak about, to spend all the money on direct service delivery, trying to convince a donor to spend money on measurement and evaluation. It's a unique challenge.
That's
Jen,
right.
You've worked with many organizations over your time. What do you think? Does it unfairly punish smaller organizations? Do you have some advice for the smaller organizations?
I just want to go back to the 100% spend on the program. I find it fascinating, even, and especially in a time when money is short, that we spend 100% on the program and we have no idea if it's making an impact. We might get some verbatim comments back, and we might have one standout case study or whatever. But wouldn't you rather spend 90% on knowing that it's working or not working or whatever, and spend 10% measuring, than just throw $100,000 out the window and have no idea? Like, that just doesn't make any sense to me, and I hear you, Edmund, because he's like, in the crunch time to spend the money on the program, but we don't know if it's making a difference, and I actually think it's, you know, as guardians, as custodians, as stewards of public money, we just need to be accountable for that money and to the beneficiaries that we work in the name of. So I really, we've got to change our mindset on this. It's not about we're taking money from the program. It's actually, we are improving the program because we are, we should be genuinely trying to work out, is it working? Is it doing any harm? And so on. So I think, yeah, that's definitely there. Look, it is definitely a challenge for the smaller organizations, but can I just say that those smaller organizations, and I've had to work with some beauties in my time, including Hope Street, which is, in Woolloomooloo in Sydney, right in the middle of Woolloomooloo, where people were rough sleeping all around, like they were walking alongside, living alongside community. So in some instances, they've got a direct line, some of the smaller orgs, and some of the bigger orgs that have become over, quite bureaucratized just because they're bigger and they're, they become more removed. So I think they have a special location and a direct line, and I think that's a real strength. But going back to my point earlier about this 10%, if smaller organizations ask for it, if you don't ask, you don't get. If they ask for it, putting together, 10% from a $10,000 grant, $50,000 grant, you scrape it together, you could actually form a position. You could either add a couple of days to a program manager or even look at a part-time monitoring person. So I think if you've got to sort of start thinking about it as a portfolio. And I think then you're looking at a proportionate and a more equitable way of funding, and you should be able to report on your programs. But I also think smaller organizations do need to, and I know it's hard because of this power imbalance, which is very real, but set some realistic expectations. And I see these wonderful grant applications come in now where the small organizations are promising the earth. And I just read it going, you're not going to create behavior change with a $10,000 project. I know you want to. I know you think it's going to get you the money, and it probably will get you the money because you've said it on your application. But you're setting yourself up for fail. You're setting yourself up. So I think we've got to be realistic about what's achievable with these smaller grants, the $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 grants. You could track some outputs. You may get some changes in knowledge and skills, for your intervention. But don't set yourself up to do an SROI or longitudinal study on a $10,000 grant. So, if program managers see what your grant applicants are writing, so number one, and just I think be a bit more realistic, be kinder to yourself, ask for some money to do some evaluation, and remember, you are in this. Often you will have strong strengths to really, get the nuance, get the learnings, get the insight, get the gold. I think funders always and community and your board would love to hear the stories as well as the statistics.
Great, Jen, thank you. We're going to talk a little bit more about overclaiming in a second because it's definitely a popular topic, but I love that tension that you call out between how could you not do this on the one hand, how do you know that what you're doing works or not, but being realistic about what you can do and what you can achieve. And as you say, we've all gone for those $10,000 grants and promised the world. Is that the thing we should be doing? Awerangi, you've got a very interesting position in the commissioning side of the world. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, we set up the commissioning agency in late 2013, 2014. But one of the things that drove it is that the Indigenous story, the Māori story, was not being shared. The outcomes of for Māori, by Māori, working in their own communities, doing it with their own people, the outcomes were not being noted and were being overlooked. And so that was a massive driver that in the current government system of funding, if you got us to compete against each other all the time, to scrap over small bits of money, we would never, ever get to the point to be able to demonstrate what really mattered to our own people. So the commissioning agency came into being. A population-based funding formula from government came to the commissioning agency as one lot. It's the first time ever we've had an Indigenous population-based funding formula and for Māori. And it meant that our 100 organisations do not compete against each other for funding. That's number one. And that money comes to the commissioning agency, just to explain the background, because that was an important driver if we were going to do things really differently. The second driver was that funding was given across different regions across the New Zealand that we serve. So, and every partner was discussed about their share of funding. So there was never competition at that level either, right? So you're setting up a very different playing field for how organisations work with each other. Now, a large number of our Māori organisations are tiny, are very, very small as well, right? So you've got very small organisations. You have got some bigger ones, but mainly small, but you also had to change the population funding formula. And then we developed broader investment buckets. So you would have immediate term outcomes for a moment of need, short-term outcomes, short to medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. Investment buckets were in those areas. That money would then go out to our partners. They would decide, and they still do, how that money is spent on the ground with their families. So we don't even say, this is a program, this is a particular service you do. You've got to show us for those broad outcome areas, what are you doing? So you're giving them a lot of choice, you're giving them a lot of flexibility. What we're just wanting to be seen as are outcomes achieving for those families. So that's some of the, I'm just going back to that because that sets the assumptions to understand how we're operating in this model. So as a result of that, we cannot put pressure on our individual small organisations to do this. It's just not going to work. So our organisations have come together in what we call regional Whānau Ora collectives. Small organisations and big. And I want to acknowledge Jen, because Jen, when we first came over and started to learn about what is collective impact, it was Jen who was doing the keynote speech on it. We were sitting there green as anything thinking, I think this could apply to us. So our business model is actually collective impact. So what we do is that we have 16 different regional groupings of our partners all come together. One partner is a big Māori organisation, and it has worked in a lot of outcomes, and that is the backbone organisation for the smaller partners in that collective. Now, they work with them to do the collective impact modelling, to do the social impact modelling, to do the social measurement. Now, those partners are coming together because they're, for the first time, not having to fight against each other, right? So they've built up trust, they've built up relationships. Now, the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency doesn't sit at the front, it sits right at the back, and it supports the backbones of each of those collectives and training and support to be able to do the social impact measurement and roll that up so the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency can take a national approach to it. But what sits alongside of that is our School of Change. It's our social impact School of Change. So every one of the 16 collectives has it. We don't have the argument about how much is measurement, how much is social impact, because it goes to the heart of what we evidence and what we prove. So it's a little bit talk about, we've had to put in something quite different because the current model in New Zealand, for all the reasons you've said, does not work in this space. So we're still only 7-8 years down the track, but it's only, and we've had to develop our own online, on-time whānau outcomes impact measurement system as well. That's taken at least 10 years to do, so that all our organisations are on that. But when you have a collectives and have a backbone that actually is role is to support doing that with its own data person, its own change management lead, its own outcome specialist, so forth, and collectives, you actually start to have a different approach. But the population-based funding formula, not competing, is a big part of that.
That's extraordinary, Awerangi. Thank you. And what I really heard from what you said is, how do you avoid setting up a system that encourages everyone to fight over the scraps? And that kind of struck at my heart because I felt like I was fighting over the scraps in many grant rounds and conversations with policies and funders. So thank you. Look, I think we have to use our last question to build on this commentary about overclaiming and the linking of funding to social impact. I'm so glad to see that this has popped up in the chat. So Johanna said, outcomes and impact reporting frameworks and requirements were developed largely to meet different funding bodies' requirements instead of what is best for the services or sector. I'm sure we've all felt like that. And I was sharing with the panel in a briefing session an experience I had just had speaking to a funding body who quite aggressively said to me, we only purchase outcomes. And as a small CEO sitting there thinking, okay, well, I better not tell you anything that doesn't work because you clearly don't want to hear that. And I better promise every outcome that I can find because that's clearly the only thing that I'm going to get funding for. And it made me really think, have we inadvertently so closely lined up funding decisions and social impact measurement to a point where we have created perverse incentives? Is it so much now that you have to do this to win funding that we've driven organisations to a space where they will choose evaluation methods that are going to favour them, that they'll look at overclaiming or impact theatre or impact washing, or just try to claim something in order to win? And I guess the question that really stuck with me is, how much does the need to sell and to win get in the way of the genuine learning that we can achieve through social impact measurement. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. And Awerangi, we might kick off with you, given it's clearly a passionate space for you and you've done a lot in the system space here. So do you see ways we can avoid this? And do you have advice for organisations that are grappling with this?
Well, first of all, it doesn't matter what system you put in place, there's always going to be perverse. People are always going to find a way around it. So, you know, it's not peculiar to social impact, is it? I mean, it's going to happen even if we can't try and design something different, there'll still be something that comes up. It's always going to be there. But two things, the difference for us has been having a population-based formula where you're not competing, because you start with a very, very different conversation. The second thing is when you seriously take on board collective impact and understand it's not you, it's about you as an organisation. It's actually about it's not about the other organisation. It's about what is the common shared agenda to really make the difference that matters. Now, as I said before, is that if you continue to see for example, in our Indigenous communities, disparities getting wider and wider, and if there is impact washing and so forth, well, hold on, something's going wrong here, because the issue is getting worse, not better, right? And so we are very clear that we need to be more accountable in our space to saying, okay, well, you can talk about all those great things you're doing for Māori if you're another non-Māori organisation, for example, but in fact, hold on a minute, those people's, the disparity is actually getting worse for them, right? And in fact, the solutions for a moment in time, it's not sustainable. Those outcomes aren't being sustained. So in the end, it always catches up because the gaps are getting bigger in some respects, right? People getting smarter about how they report on it. But in fact, when we go home to our communities, it's worse. And I tell you what, COVID showed that for us, absolutely, in our Indigenous Māori space. In fact, that just opened up even more so what people thought they were doing in that space. But in reality, when we're dealing with our Indigenous people in COVID, it totally showed that what you said over here and what the reality is of what our Indigenous people are dealing with was quite different. But also these things like, you know, people can say all they want to say, but, you know, is it the culture of the organisation? Is it embedded properly at a governance level? Is it part of their day-to-day working, or is it just a one-off thing they're doing for funding and bringing it on? But there are some good things to that. You know, we are involved with the national health reforms, and we are very clear that non-Māori organisations who do have contracts and outputs to work in Māori organisations who may not necessarily have done a good job, for us, we've set up our very first time Māori Health Authority to measure what non-Māori organisations are doing in this space. And for us is actually for the first time, they have to report specifically on what are the Māori outcomes they're achieving. And if they aren't achieving those Māori outcomes, that for the first time becomes a lever about how Māori organisations, who we know can do that very well, can do it better. So there's pros and cons of each approach, depending on what side of the fence that you look at for that particular issue. But it is all about programs still, because that's the business modelling of the government we work in. Top down, tick off it's a tick program still, right? But the agencies that we're working with are now, the 3 agencies that we're working with on this joint funding across votes for the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency. See, it's always a learning journey. For the first time, they're coming on the journey with us, not to tell us what to do, but sitting there behind us. They have a governance group, they look at the learning. Now, it's from learning and sitting behind us and seeing what's happening on the front line. Are they starting to change the way they look at outcomes, way they invest in outcomes, and doing it for a more genuine approach from a ground up model, which has a different type of focus than tick the model. Here's what we want done for a specific program. So there's not a really clear answer to it. I'm just saying it's learnings all the time. It took us a massive amount of time to get 3 votes to come together, put funding for us. So you can't just say, oh, let's just do that, because you are relying a lot on goodwill of CEOs at the time, and you also rely, we're at different contexts. We have Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet who are leading the wellbeing approach. So there's a push there to have like-minded government agencies come together for integrated funding, but in a way where they sit back and they learn from what's happening at the front. But that learning and coming together and being together for 2 days to share learnings is one of the best things we could have done with those government agencies, because they recognise they might have to have 2 models. Their business as usual, because that's just a rally they work in, but starting to look at how they can invest more in this other model, which may do things differently to support vulnerable communities, but they could potentially take the learnings to say, how can they put that in the usual government business model? So I'm afraid there is no answer. We just have to be a bit cautious about it, but we're just about to release a report early next year that when you do outcomes and you bring outcomes together across 100 organisations, yes, you can prove the outcomes that maybe government agencies want, but far more than that, there's a deeper level. We actually can show the change in families over time. So going from crisis to stability to resilience to being the leaders of their own families to families being leaders in the communities, because you need that deeper layer if you're going to look at sustainable outcomes. And that is part of the elephant in the room, is moving to the deeper layer. And you can't get to that deeper layer unless you have the communities who live and breathe it, own that space, because it doesn't come from being done to them. Now, the third deeper layer is that by collecting this information in this pilot we've had going, for the very first time, we're able to share a report with Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet on how we've been able to reduce child poverty. Now, you can't reduce child poverty in a contract, in a service, in a program, but when you bring that together, for the very first time, when you have a systems approach, a movement approach, we're seeing something far more deeper. So there's three different levels of looking at it. But just the last thing from me, and I know you said to be provocative, so I know this was the last question, it might not be quite a provocative, is that, look, I'm really conscious that I'm here as an Indigenous person talking about it. And, you know, really the question for us is, how many organisations are doing it to Indigenous communities, and what time are you going to have your own Indigenous community taking my place? And they talk about and are leading the whole outcome space, because once they lead this conversation, rather than others saying what they do to them, then really you'll get to that deeper transformation, them owning the platform for families, so you get a more enduring approach. So I'm just leaving that there as food for thought too. Okay.
Thank you, Awerangi. Great provocation to finish up there. And you've consistently emphasised throughout the need for this to be a journey and to involve the communities that it's impacting. Now, panel, I am aware that we are standing in the way of the awards. So what I'm going to ask Edmund and Jen, if you can give us one takeaway on that question. And then I've asked each of the panelists to give just their, if you only remember one thing that the panelists say. We know that we're all exceptionally busy and we're all waiting to have a drink at the awards, but what's the one key takeaway that you can take from this conversation? Edmund, we might go to you first.
For me, I would say to always be transparent in your social valuation measurement work. It is, as I said earlier, it's still a gray space for many people, staying outside of the black and white. And I think that the more transparent you can be with what you're doing, how you're doing, what you intend to achieve, it at least leaves it open for discussion. And if you are lost a little bit along the way, it allows people to come in to help redirect you. So transparency and authenticity in this space are key for me.
Brilliant, thank you. Jen.
Look, I think, you know, this point about the conditions in which we operate is so critical. And I think Awerangi has brought that out so loud and clear, that if the conditions are changed, the system will change and we will start to do things differently. But until we change the conditions, we will get the same results, right? So the only way we're going to turn this impact washing and impact theatre on its head is to change the game. And I think grantors and funders have a big role to play here in valuing what doesn't work as much as what does work, which ties in nicely with what Edmund was saying about transparency. So we need to stop talking about success. I'd like us to just talk about what is. You know, let's take the emotion, let's take the hate out of it, and we need to start valuing the learnings. We need to hold up them as heroes, you know, not just, you know, what's been a successful program, but where the greatest learnings have taken place. Because eventually, you know, we'll get to this great place of changing and doing good work. I think that we need to have learning circles that enable these conversations, and that's that conditions of setting up these conditions so conversations can be had in a way where people can share, because otherwise of course they're going to do impact washing if they think their very existence is connected to them telling a success story. So until you change the rules of the game, which is what they've done so well in New Zealand, where it's about this population change and they're not competing and their very existence isn't hanging on them telling us, you know, this sort of wonderful story, or this payment for success or payment for outcomes, which we know doesn't work. We need a license to operate. So that's my, probably my takeaway is social measurement as license to operate rather than it being about successful results. It's about your capacity to learn and improve. So yeah, that's probably my end there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jen. Well, we are very much out of time, but I hope that you have all seen my strategy here of inviting brilliant people to come and share their thoughts. There's been some amazing provocations today. We've explored lots of areas, and just a quick couple of takeaways from me. I think we've heard from all three panelists that the future of social impact measurement is really starting to look at the systems level. This is beyond just now the transactional individual evaluations. How do we create the conditions for this to happen and happen consistently? And I'm just going to leave everyone with Jen's challenge because I really like it, which is if we don't do this, then someone else will, and that potentially can be robots replacing us. And I think that's the last place we'd all want to get to, where measurement and evaluation just becomes an incredibly reductionist space when there's so much promise and opportunity out there. So thank you so much, Edmund. Thank you so much, Awerangi. Thank you so much, Jen. Really appreciate your participation. I know everyone has valued your thoughts and exploration.